So if you've decided now that you want to stretch, how do you go about it? How do you go about it safely and effectively? I'm going to show you one of the simplest methods for stretching. There are other ways of doing it, but I'm not going to go into those. Those require quite sophisticated training, and you actually need a person there with you to take you through it. So if you want to do that, feel fine. Make sure you get someone though who is properly trained, because the more sophisticated methods can cause injury if they're not used properly. Hi, I'm Kashmir, and as part of my Safe Dance Practices unit, we covered stretching. So that's quite an important part for dancers to know how to stretch effectively. In addition, I spent a lot of time, well over 80 hours, with a sports physio going through things like stretches in a hands-on situation. So we actually had hands-on workshops and we tried various things on each other and ourselves. So I think I know a wee bit about the basics of stretching. For those of you who didn't see the other video about whether or not you actually need to stretch, just a quick bit of a revision. What do I mean by stretching? When I say stretching, I don't mean loosening up. I call that mobilization. So at the beginning of a dance session, you might just sort of give yourself a bit of a wiggle, make sure everything works. That's not a stretch. That's a mobilization. That's whatever you want to call it, because you're not taking your muscles beyond their resting length. So a stretch is elongating your muscle fibers, taking your muscle fibers beyond their resting length. So you're trying to reset them. So as you know, muscles, they come in layers and they interact and they contract. That's how a muscle works. The only thing a muscle can do is it contract or relaxes. So when it works, the muscle contracts and the fibers slide in. Now in some cases, those fibers may slide in too far and shorten the muscle. So what we're doing with the stretch is we take those muscle fibers out beyond that resting length, we hold it, and then we release it, and we hope that when it goes back, it won't go all the way back in, that it will actually end up at a resting point somewhere between where it was before we started and where the actual stretch is. So we're elongating the muscle fibers. It's not about feeling good, it's not about giving yourself a bit of a wiggle. We're actually trying to change our muscles. That's what a stretch is. So if we want to do this, there's a few general principles we need to keep in mind. Firstly, you must only ever try and stretch a warm muscle. So give the muscle its due. It should be relaxed to start with, okay? You want it as relaxed and as warm as you can start with, then you start extending it. So don't try and stretch a cold muscle. So stretching should go after you have been moving, after a warm-up. So in my classes, for example, if we do stretching, which we don't do an awful lot of, we'll be going warm-up, dance class, and then any stretching will be at the end. The next important principle is that you cannot stretch a contracted muscle. So if your muscle is actually doing its job, it's pulling in, you can't stretch it. Okay? It wants to pull in. The whole point of stretching is that muscle's got to be relaxed enough that you can actually pull the muscle fibers apart. So you can't, for example, do a standing hamstring stretch. Well, you can, but you only can do the leg that you aren't standing on. If you're standing on both legs, you cannot stretch your hamstrings. I'll have people say, oh, I can feel the stretch. No, you can't. What you're feeling is you're feeling the muscle working. So an important thing to learn if you're going to be doing any stretch work is to feel the difference between a working muscle and a stretching muscle. Standing here at the moment, I am not stretching my hamstrings. The hamstrings are those big muscles at the back of my thigh are keeping me from falling over. They are working, therefore I cannot be stretching them. And just take it to the point where you start to feel it stretching. You're not actually taking it as far as you can, because if you do that, it's not going to work. Just take it so you can just start to feel that resistance. At that point, stop, breathe, just keep on breathing, and you'll get to the point where the muscle starts to feel like it's softening. It's like, oh, I don't seem to be getting the stretch anymore. In that case, give it a bit more. Bend over a little bit more or lift it a bit higher. How long do you hold a stretch? Well, it depends. You're looking for that softening. With a big muscle like a hamstring, you're holding for 30 seconds, a minute, maybe even longer. So you need to hold until you feel it, and you need to repeat a couple of times. How often is every second day probably as a minimum. Once a week doesn't do it. Now this is one reason why I don't spend a lot of time doing stretches in my classes. If your only stretch you're doing is at the end of class, it's a complete waste of time. Back when I did serious dance work, I was stretching 20 to 35, 40 minutes every day, and I'd actually alternate the stretches, so I wouldn't be doing the same ones each day. So a stretch regime takes a bit of time. What do you decide to stretch? And here's the next one. Not everyone has to stretch the same thing. You should stretch what parts of your body are stiff. How do you find out? Well, there's ways that it can be measured. The simplest way is to actually get a sports physio or someone like that to do an assessment, and they'll go through all the major things, and they will pick out what are the most important things that need to be done. So you need to actually do them possibly in a particular order, or some things may be more important than others, or some things may affect another. So if you get this one right, then this one's not going to be a problem anymore. When you stretch, you target specific muscle groups. There's no point in actually just sort of doing a generalized stretch like the splits. The splits uses so many different muscle groups, and as I said earlier, those groups that are already flexible will give, and the other ones will sit there going, oh, well, I don't have to do any work because the other muscles are doing the stretching. Whenever possible, target a single muscle group and make sure you're doing the stretch correctly. So for example, if you're doing a calf stretch, which I don't need to do because my calves are one of the most flexible parts of my body, it's important, for example, to line your feet up in parallel. If you've got one foot turned out, you're actually stretching the muscle differently. It's also important to make sure that the weight is on the front leg, because if you haven't got the weight on the front leg, the back leg is going to be actually working, and again you're not going to get it to stretch properly. It seems like a lot, but it isn't. The principles are simple. Always stretch a warm muscle. Never try and stretch a working muscle. Hold until it softens and then push it a bit further. Always target specific muscle groups. When you're doing a stretch, you should know what you are stretching, and you should have an exercise that stretches just that muscle if at all possible. So, what are you waiting for?